Picture this. It's July 1944, the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The air is thick with cigar smoke and celebration. 730 delegates from 44 allied nations are toasting their success. They have just spent 3 weeks designing a new global financial system from scratch. They believe they have finally tamed the economic chaos that led to the Great Depression. They believe they have architected a permanent golden age of prosperity. The mood is unanimous, except for one man. His name is Jacques Rueff. He's a French economist, and he is not celebrating. He's looking at the mathematical structure they just created, and he sees a fatal flaw, a ticking time bomb, built into the system's very foundation. While the world's financial elite congratulate themselves, Rueff is already calculating the exact mechanism of the system's collapse. His warnings would be dismissed, ridiculed, and ignored for 27 years, until the day they came true with stunning mathematical precision. Here's what should grab your attention. America had an 80-year warning about our current monetary crisis. The same fundamental problems Rueff identified in 1944 are screaming at us today. And we are still not listening. To understand why it's now too late, we have to go back to that hotel. The new system was called Bretton Woods. Its goal was simple: prevent the currency wars and trade collapses of the 1930s. The solution was to anchor the entire world. The delegates agreed to peg every major currency, like the British pound or the French franc, to the US dollar. And the US dollar, in turn, would be pegged to physical gold. The price was fixed by law, $35 per troy ounce. This was the gold window. It was a contract. Any foreign central bank at any time could show up at the U.S. Treasury, hand over its paper, and receive a fixed amount of physical gold in return. This made the U.S. dollar as good as gold. It was a privilege no nation or empire had ever known. America's currency was the world's currency, but Jacques Rueff saw that it wasn't a privilege, it was a trap. He immediately spotted the impossible mathematics. For the post-war world to rebuild and grow, it needed a global currency to finance trade. That currency was the U.S. dollar. To get those dollars out into the world, America had to run a balance of payments deficit. Think of it this way. America had to buy more goods from other countries than it sold to them. We had to spend more dollars abroad than we took in. This pumped paper dollars into the global economy, which is what everyone wanted. But here's the catch that made Rueff's blood run cold. Every single one of those paper dollars was a legal IOU, a claim check for our physical gold. Rueff warned that the world's demand for dollars would eventually force us to issue more claim checks than we had gold in our vaults. It was a mathematical certainty. The system required its own destruction. It was designed to fail, but in 1944 this warning sounded absurd. America was an economic colossus. World War II had destroyed our competitors and supercharged our industry, and we had the gold. By 1949, U.S. gold reserves peaked at 20,279 metric tons. It was nearly 70% of the entire world's gold supply. Our vaults were overflowing. American leaders looked at Rueff's calculations and laughed. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau dismissed the French concerns. He said they still think like it's the 19th century. This wasn't just ignorance. It was willful blindness. It was powered by a deep-seated belief in American exceptionalism. Our leaders were so confident in our economic might. They believed the rules of mathematics simply did not apply to us. They truly thought foreign countries would be happy to accumulate our paper IOUs forever. They never believed they would actually show up to cash them in. They were wrong. The warning didn't just come from Rueff. In 1960, a Belgian-American economist at Yale named Robert Triffin formalized the idea. It became known as the Triffin dilemma. Triffin proved that the system had an inescapable contradiction. The world needed more dollars to grow, but the gold peg required the U.S. to create fewer dollars to maintain trust. The U.S. was trapped between two opposing demands. It could either protect the gold peg and starve the world of liquidity, likely causing a depression, or it could supply the world with dollars, break the gold peg, and cause a currency crisis. It was a choice between two economic disasters. For a while, America tried to do both, but the math was already catching up. By the early 1950s, Rueff's predictions were already coming true. The balance of payments deficit was growing. America's mountain of gold, which peaked at 20,279 tons in 1949, began its long, steady decline. By 1957, it was down to 20,312 tons. By 1960, it had fallen to 17,800 tons. The IOUs were slowly coming home. Then came the 1960s, and the U.S. government decided to fund two massive simultaneous projects. At home, President Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society social programs. Abroad, the rapidly expanding Vietnam War, the cost of the war exploded. It went from $1.7 billion in 1965 to $20.9 billion by 1968. Instead of raising taxes to pay for it all, the U.S. government did something easier. It printed money. The Federal Reserve monetized the debt. Hundreds of billions of new paper dollars flooded the global system, dollars that had no new gold backing them. Other countries weren't stupid. They watched this flood of paper, they looked at their swelling stacks of U.S. dollars, and then they looked at America's shrinking pile of gold. They did the math. The U.S. was writing checks it could no longer cash. The 1944 warning was no longer a theory, it was a crisis. Which brings us back to Jacques Rueff. By the 1960s, he wasn't just an academic. He was the chief economic advisor to French President Charles de Gaulle. And de Gaulle decided to turn Rueff's mathematical warnings into official French policy. In February 1965, de Gaulle held a press conference that sent shockwaves through Washington. He stood before the cameras and called out America's exorbitant privilege. He said it was fundamentally unfair for the U.S. to pay for its deficits with paper money that it printed, while other countries had to pay with actual goods and labor. He cited Rueff's arguments directly. He declared that France would no longer accept these paper promises. He demanded a return to the gold standard. And he announced France would be trading its dollars for physical gold. This was not just talk. De Gaulle launched Operation Vetus. He began systematically converting France's dollar reserves into gold. In 1965 alone, he traded $150 million for 1,360 tons of gold. He even sent the French Navy to New York Harbor. Not to start a war, but to make a withdrawal. Between 1963 and 1966, France repatriated 3,313 tons of gold from U.S. vaults. The run on the bank had officially begun, and Jacques Rueff was holding the deposit slip. America's response was pure, predictable dismissal. The Johnson administration immediately activated its playbook. It characterized de Gaulle's statements as the jealous rantings of a fated empire. Secretary of State Dean Rusk told reporters that France was living in the past. They said de Gaulle simply didn't understand the benefits of modern dollar-based finance. It was the exact same rhetoric they had used against Rueff in 1944. But here's what makes this story so infuriating. While American officials were publicly dismissing these warnings, declassified Federal Reserve meeting minutes released decades later show they were privately panicking. They knew. They knew the math was failing. They knew Rueff and de Gaulle were right. In closed-door sessions, they were already discussing emergency measures to limit the gold outflows. But they couldn't admit it publicly. Admitting the problem would be the problem. It would trigger the very crisis of confidence they were trying to prevent. And the run was spreading. De Gaulle had shown everyone the emergency exit. Spain followed, pulling out $60 million. Germany began to quietly ask for its gold back. Switzerland, Belgium, and the Netherlands all joined in. They were all racing to get their gold out before the window slammed shut. America's gold reserves were in free fall. From 17,800 tons in 1960, the pile shrunk to 15,000 tons. Then 12,000 tons by 1968. The system was hemorrhaging. The 1944 promise was breaking, ton by ton. The final breaking point was the London Gold Pool. This was a cartel of 8 central banks, led by the U.S. Federal Reserve. Its one and only job was to defend the $35 price. When the market price of gold tried to rise above $35, the pool would dump tons of physical gold onto the open market to suppress the price. It was an open manipulation scheme to maintain confidence in the paper dollar. But in March 1968, the panic buying became too much. A tidal wave of demand, triggered by the ongoing crisis, hit the market. The London gold pool was forced to sell gold at a catastrophic rate. In just 3 months, the pool lost over 1,000 tons. On March 17, 1968, the cartel collapsed. They announced they would no longer sell gold on the private market. The market had won, the $35 price was a fiction. This was the crisis Rueff had predicted, almost to the year. The warning signs were no longer just flashing, they were screaming. Yet American officials still refused to admit the truth. Treasury Secretary Henry Fowler went on television. He announced that the fundamentals of the dollar remained strong. He insisted that convertibility for central banks was never in question. They were lying. They were just buying time. They had created a two-tier gold system, a desperate last-ditch patch. But everyone knew the game was over. It was just a matter of who would be the last one holding the paper. The countdown was approaching zero. August 13, 1971, Camp David, Maryland. President Richard Nixon sits across from his top economic advisors, men like Treasury Secretary John Connally and Fed official Paul Volcker. They are staring at numbers that would have made Jacques Rueff smile with bitter satisfaction. After 27 years of dismissing warnings, America was finally facing the exact scenario the French economist had predicted. The numbers on the table told the story of a terminal collapse. U.S. gold reserves had fallen to just over 9,000 tons. But foreign central banks now held over $40 billion in paper dollar claims. At the official $35 rate, America owed foreigners 4 times more gold than existed in Fort Knox. This wasn't a temporary liquidity crisis. This wasn't a speculator problem. This was the mathematical endgame Jacques Rueff had calculated in 1944. It was playing out exactly as he'd predicted. John Connally delivered the brutal truth to Nixon. We may never go back to it. Convertibility. I suspect we never will. Paul Volcker, who was in that room, would later admit it. The French were right about the mathematics. Here's where the story gets truly infuriating. Even as Nixon prepared to prove Rueff's warnings correct, his administration planned to frame the collapse exactly as Rueff had predicted they would. Rueff had warned in the 1950s that when the end came, America would never admit the system was fundamentally flawed. Instead, they would claim it was a temporary emergency. They would promise to return to the system later. And they would blame outside forces. On the evening of August 15, 1971, Nixon addressed the nation. His speech could have been written by Rueff himself. He announced the temporary suspension of the dollar's convertibility into gold. He blamed international money speculators for forcing this emergency action. He promised America would work toward restored stability. It was a masterclass in political theater, and every word of it was a lie. The temporary suspension is now 54 years old. In a single speech, America defaulted on its 1944 promise to the entire world. Jacques Rueff, now in his 70s, lived to see his 1944 calculation vindicated. The warning had come true. But here is what should terrify you. We are living through the exact same warning all over again. The mathematics that destroyed Bretton Woods didn't disappear. They simply took a new form. We just swapped one impossible promise for another. In 1944, the dollar was a promise backed by gold. Since 1971, the dollar is a promise backed by ... nothing. It is a fiat currency backed only by the full faith and credit of the United States, which means it's backed by the government's ability to service its debt. We've traded one mathematical impossibility for another. And the new math is even worse. Let's look at the numbers. In 1971, when the gold window closed, U.S. national debt was $400 billion. Today, it is over $35 trillion. That's an increase of 8,650%. Our debt is now 122% of our entire annual economic output. According to the Congressional Budget Office, we are on track to add another $20 trillion in debt over the next 10 years. The interest payments alone on this debt have exploded to over $1 trillion per year. Interest is now the second largest expense in the federal budget. It has surpassed what we spend on national defense. This is Jacques Rueff's nightmare, version 2.0, infinite money creation, infinite debt, backed by promises we cannot mathematically keep. And what is the rest of the world doing? They are reading from the 1965 playbook. They see the new impossible math. They see the U.S. printing trillions of dollars since 2008. And again in 2020, they see the U.S. weaponize the dollar, freezing the reserves of any country it disagrees with. So they are responding. The BRICS nations, China, Russia, India, Brazil, South Africa, are doing exactly what Charles de Gaulle did. They are building an exit. They are systematically reducing their dollar reserves. They are creating alternative payment systems to bypass the U.S.-controlled SWIFT network. They are settling trade between themselves and their own currencies. And what are their central banks buying with their trade profits? Not our paper IOUs. They are buying physical gold. In 2022, central banks bought a record 1,136 tons. In 2023, they bought another 1,037 tons. They are doing exactly what France did. They are quietly, systematically trading their paper dollars for a real asset. They are preparing for the day the math fails again. And what is America's response? The exact same playbook of denial and dismissal. When China announces new gold purchases, calls it economic nationalism. When Russia and Brazil trade in their own currencies, we dismiss them as authoritarian, attempts to undermine global stability. It's the same script from 1965. We are calling our critics jealous and outdated. We are insisting the fundamentals of the dollar are strong. Our leaders are so intoxicated by the exorbitant privilege of printing the world's money. They are ignoring the countdown clock that Rueff started 80 years ago. The math didn't care about American arrogance in 1971. It doesn't care now. The 1944 system collapsed because it was based on a mathematical impossibility. The 1971 system is based on an even bigger one. So here is the question. Do you think the U.S. can outrun its $35 trillion debt math? Or are we living through the final years of the fiat dollar system?